Welcome to the show, folks. Today we're diving deep into a topic that's got me fascinated and a little bit perplexed, to be honest. The fall of Chinese martial arts. You're talking about systems with centuries, even millennia, of history. These were fighting styles forged in warfare, used by warriors, and feared on battlefields. We're talking about legendary stuff, man. Shaolin monks, masters of kung fu. These were the real-deal badasses. But somewhere along the line, something changed. Traditional Chinese martial arts, the stuff that was once feared and respected, seems to have devolved into something different. It's like the combat effectiveness got lost in translation, replaced with flashy moves and theatrical routines. It's more about performance than practicality these days. So the question is, how did this happen? How did these once deadly fighting systems become more about dance than destruction? That's what we're going to unpack today. So to understand what happened to Chinese martial arts, you gotta go back to a pretty dark period in China's history, the Cultural Revolution. Now, this was Mao Zedong's attempt to reshape Chinese society, to purge it of anything he considered old or counter-revolutionary. And guess what fell right into that category? You got it, traditional martial arts. See, Kung Fu wasn't just about fighting, it was intertwined with Chinese philosophy, history, and spirituality. It was part of their cultural fabric. But to Mao, this was dangerous. It represented the old ways, the old China he wanted to destroy. So what happened? They went after the masters. These weren't just guys who knew how to throw a punch. They were living repositories of knowledge, techniques passed down for generations. And they were targeted, persecuted, sometimes even killed. Think about that, man. Imagine a government going after jiu-jitsu black belts, MMA coaches, anyone with real fighting knowledge. That's what these masters faced. And it wasn't just the physical persecution. It was the fear, the silencing. People were afraid to practice openly, afraid to pass on their knowledge. Schools were shut down, lineages broken. It was like hitting the delete button on centuries of martial wisdom. Now, some might say, okay, but the Cultural Revolution ended, right? True, but the damage was done. Imagine a forest fire ripping through a national park. Yeah, the fire eventually goes out, but the ecosystem is devastated. That's what happened to Chinese martial arts. The knowledge, the real combat skills, they were driven underground. What emerged later, what was allowed to be taught openly, was often watered down, stripped of its effectiveness. It became more about performance, about keeping the tradition alive in a superficial way, rather than a practical fighting art. It was the only way to survive. So the Cultural Revolution decimated the ranks of true masters, the guys who knew the real deal. But it also created a vacuum. People still craved that connection to their culture, to the legacy of Kung Fu. And into that void stepped a new breed of practitioner, the performer. Now don't get me wrong, these guys were often incredibly skilled athletes. Their acrobatics, their weapon handling, it's amazing to watch. But it was more about spectacle, about entertainment than actual combat. It's like the difference between a WWE wrestler and a UFC fighter. And this shift was encouraged. The Chinese government, now promoting a message of peace and stability, saw the value in this sanitized version of Kung Fu. It was exotic, it was visually stunning, it was a great way to showcase Chinese culture to the world. Think about all those Kung Fu movies that came out in the 70s and 80s. Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, these guys became global icons. But their style, while entertaining as hell, wasn't exactly battlefield ready. It was choreographed, exaggerated, meant for the big screen. And as this performance-based martial arts flourished, the practical, combat-focused stuff faded further into the background. It became relegated to small, often secretive groups, far removed from the bright lights and government support. This wasn't just about aesthetics, though. It was about control. By emphasizing the performance aspect, the government could control the narrative, dictate what Kung Fu represented. It became less of a threat, less of a potential source of dissent, and more of a tool for cultural diplomacy. Now, it's not like all combat effectiveness vanished from Chinese martial arts. There's one glaring exception, a style that emerged in the midst of all this: Sanda. Imagine taking the raw, brutal efficiency of Muay Thai and mixing it with the takedowns and throws of Judo. That's Sanda in a nutshell. It's a full-contact sport. Punches, kicks, knees, elbows, takedowns, throws, even limited ground fighting. It's all on the table. Sanda fighters don't mess around. They're tough, they're conditioned, and they're trained to knock you out. Now, some traditionalists will tell you Sanda isn't real Kung Fu. They'll say it's too modern, too influenced by other styles. And yeah, Sanda incorporates elements from various fighting systems, but that's kind of the point. It's about taking what works, regardless of origin, and forging it into a practical, effective fighting style. And here's the thing. Sanda is the only form of Chinese martial arts that's consistently tested in the crucible of full-contact competition. You don't see Tai Chi masters stepping into the ring with MMA fighters, do you? But even Sanda, as brutal and effective as it is, isn't immune to the pressures facing other Chinese martial arts. It's still controlled, regulated, and used to promote a certain image of Chinese strength. But beneath the surface, in those grueling training halls and intense competitions, you can still see glimpses of the fighting spirit that once defined Kung Fu. Here's where things get really interesting and kind of messed up, to be honest. While the Chinese government was busy suppressing the combat aspect of Kung Fu within its borders, it was simultaneously promoting it globally as this beautiful, harmonious cultural export. It's like selling a Lamborghini, but disabling the engine and welding the doors shut. They built these elaborate Kung Fu schools, sent out polished ambassadors to teach these watered-down forms, and funded lavish performances showcasing the mystical powers of Tai Chi masters. It's all part of China's soft power strategy, using culture and image to enhance their global standing. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing inherently wrong with promoting your culture, but there's something disingenuous, even manipulative, about presenting this sanitized, toothless version of Kung Fu while actively suppressing its true essence. It's like they're trying to have it both ways. They want the global recognition and admiration that comes with having a badass martial art, but without the inherent danger of a population trained in actual combat. And this creates a bizarre situation where you have millions of people around the world practicing forms and techniques that would crumble under the slightest pressure in a real fight. They're being sold this illusion of martial prowess, while the real deal is kept locked away, reserved for a select few. Now, if you want to see just how far this suppression of real Kung Fu goes, look no further than the story of Xu Xiaodong. This dude is a mixed martial artist, a Sanda practitioner, and a total disruptor. He's basically the Chinese MMA community's version of a bull in a china shop. Xu made it his mission to expose what he saw as fraudulent Kung Fu masters, the guys making outlandish claims of supernatural abilities and unbeatable techniques. He challenged them to fights, publicly called them out, and in the process became a viral sensation. And here's the thing, Xu often won. He beat these supposed masters, sometimes in embarrassing fashion, exposing their claims as hollow and their techniques as ineffective. He was like the ultimate skeptic, using the brutal reality of MMA to shatter the illusions surrounding traditional Kung Fu. Now, you'd think a guy like Xu, someone promoting real combat skills, would be celebrated in China, right? Wrong. The authorities came down on him like a ton of bricks. He was censored, sued, banned from social media, and basically forced into hiding. Why? Because he was disrupting the carefully crafted narrative. He was exposing the gap between the myth and the reality, and the powers that be couldn't have that. They couldn't risk letting the world see that the emperor, or in this case the Kung Fu master, had no clothes. Xu's story is a stark reminder that in China, some things are more important than winning or losing a fight. It's about control, about maintaining the image, even if it means sacrificing authenticity and silencing dissenting voices. So, where does this leave us? Is traditional Chinese martial arts still relevant in real combat, or has it become a relic of the past, more about performance and preservation than practicality? It's a complex issue. There's no easy answer. On one hand, you have the undeniable beauty and cultural significance of these ancient systems. The discipline, the philosophy, the connection to history, these are all valuable and worth preserving. But on the other hand, you can't ignore the reality that much of what's practiced today as Kung Fu is a far cry from the combat-tested systems of old. It's been diluted, sanitized, and in some cases, outright corrupted. And that's the real tragedy here. This rich, complex martial heritage has been, in many ways, lost in translation. It's been co-opted, controlled, and stripped of its essence.